Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast with pretty bad memories about Rob Ford. I am Jason from Not Just Bikes, and I'm joined today by Bobby Broccoli. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I noticed the other day when I was looking through the latest releases on Nebula that you have released a video about Rob Ford, the infamous crack-smoking mayor of Toronto. And I must admit that I put it in my watch later, and I was like, I need to be in the right mental state before I watch this because I lived through some of the Rob Ford years, and I didn't really want to bring back those memories. But in the end, it was a very good video. And I understand this is a series that you're going to do. Is that right?
Yeah, so the first of 4 parts is out. That one mainly covers, his rise to power and his election as mayor. The other 3 I'm working on right now, and eventually will come out and cover pretty much the entire saga of him in Toronto.
Is it going to be 4 videos in the end?
In total, it's 4. And then they're segmented into the different arcs of his career. So part 2 is what he did as mayor pre the giant scandal that brought him down. Part 3 is mostly the scandal. And then part 4 is afterwards. And there's a surprising amount of afterwards.
Yeah, it was a thing for sure. So I lived in Toronto. I guess of all the places I've lived in my adult life, I've lived in a lot. But I think Toronto is the longest because I lived there between 2000 and then I left in 2006. So that would have been mostly David Miller type time, stuff like that. And then into the beginning. I mean, Rob Ford was a councillor then. But then I left before Rob Ford got elected. And then I came back to Toronto in 2013 and left again in 2018. So I got to see some of the mess that he created. And then I got to vote for Olivia Chow before I took off to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, so the whole scandal took off in 2013, which for me was probably one of the very first political stories that I strongly paid attention to because I was a teenager then. And obviously it was not just national news, it was international news. It was everywhere. Yeah. The actual motivation for this series I made, I was traveling in Germany a year or so ago. And one of the few things the Germans I was talking to knew about Canada was the infamous crack-smoking mayor of Toronto.
Oh, my God.
And I was kind of thinking, I can probably add a lot of context to this being from the area.
Wow. That's actually kind of scary, but that's what Canada is known for, done by some Germans. Oh, so in case you're listening to this and you don't know of Rob Ford, consider yourself lucky. He died several years ago, but he was a city councillor in Toronto who was very loud and obnoxious, but managed to get quite the cult following behind him. And we'll talk about that in Ford Nation and some of that. And he eventually became the mayor of Toronto, and he was wildly incompetent and caused a lot of issues. But he also just used to show up drunk a lot of the time. I remember I used to get really involved in Toronto city politics when I was doing advocacy there. And so I would watch city council meetings. They streamed them on YouTube. They did back then too. And so I would be watching the live streams. And Rob Ford was incoherent sometimes, just not even understanding where he was and what was going on. And he would insult people and there were all these scandals. But then eventually it was found that he had smoked crack cocaine, very likely several times, which became a massive issue. But that, along with his incompetence, caused the city council to kick him out effectively. And I mean, there's so much to be said about Rob Ford that you could probably make 4 video essays about it, to be honest. So tell me, so you decided you'd spoken to some Germans and you thought maybe I should make this a series of videos. Well, okay, when you went into this, did you think it was going to be 4 videos? Was that your plan?
I mean, every time I make something, I think this is going to be the one that's short. It's going to be a one-off as a break. The day in Germany when I got the idea, I went onto Wikipedia and I immediately started making notes. And I was like, I can do this in 1 part. And then by the time I was back and just actually sketching an outline, it had ballooned to 3. And then later on, it split into 4 because I just wanted to really capture the different eras of the Ford scandal. I think a big thing that is kind of misremembered is that people think the crack scandal is what brought down his term as mayor and that he was doing fine beforehand. That's actually a big misconception. Yeah. By the time that it happened in 2013, there'd basically been a mutiny among his coalition on council. People who used to be his allies had decided we've had enough. we're going to kind of take the reins and move things in a different direction, because he really pissed a lot of people off. He was not a good collaborator. He didn't like to compromise, and a lot of things had gone wrong already by that point.
Yeah, and I do get really frustrated. Like, even when I wasn't living in Toronto between 2006 and 2013, I was following Toronto quite closely because, I have lots of friends and family there, and I still have a connection there. And so I would follow the news and I'd talk to friends, and I would go back at least twice a year at those times. And it does really frustrate me when people talk about Rob Ford and they'll say things like, oh, yeah, well, if it wasn't for if it wasn't for his addiction, it would have been fine. Or, yeah, he was a bit obnoxious, but at least he saved the city $1 billion, or some of these other ridiculous things that people say who just clearly weren't paying attention during that time. And actually, I'm really looking forward to you having the videos out so that they are things that I can point people to and say, no, 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 no. Don't be confusing this history here.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing. There's a lot of myths that have been created about Rob Ford. He was very good at mythologizing himself, but
That's true.
I guess context for those who aren't familiar, Rob Ford is actually part of a political family in Canada that is quite prominent. They've sometimes been called the Canadian Kennedys. I don't think that's a perfect comparison, but in terms of prominence, they are quite a famous family in Canada. There is the father, Doug Sr. He was just kind of a random backbencher.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, he wasn't like a really well-known politician. He was involved in the Conservative Party. And if I remember correctly, he was more on the like alliance side of things than the Progressive Conservatives when they had that split.
I would say, I think federally he probably was, but he was only ever in the provincial assembly, which has different like
Right. Yeah,
dynamics.
it was a different party.
I think it's best to describe him as a Mike Harris conservative, because
Okay.
that was the premier he served under. Mike Harris is a pretty pivotal figure in Canadian politics because he was very much of the same era of like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
He was very small government. We need to reduce the number of politicians. We need to save money. He went to war with unions, a lot of things. Probably the most pivotal thing he did in this specific story is he amalgamated Toronto, kind of by surprise. This is not something he campaigned on. He just, 2 years into his term, he said, we're going to take the 6 cities in the Toronto metro area and we're going to make them one city. And basically nobody wanted this,
Yeah.
even people within his own party. But legally, there was nothing they could do to stop it. And that's why Rob Ford was technically a resident of Toronto, because his town of Etobicoke was merged with these 5 others.
Yeah, amalgamation was, oh, that was such a mess. You talk about like you were a teenager and you saw the Rob Ford scandal and stuff like that. When I was a late teenager, I was following the amalgamation thing. And I wasn't living in Toronto at the time that happened, because I think that happened in the 90s. Is that
It was 97, 98.
97? Yeah, okay. So I was at university in Waterloo at the time. But I remember following that in the news, and it was just, yeah, everybody at the time was like, who asked for this? And so just to bring everybody listening up to speed, Toronto was 6 different cities. What we called Toronto was what's now called Old Toronto. Typically, it's just the sort of downtown and surrounding streetcar suburbs. And all of those other 5 cities were independent. They did share some things. And I mean, Bobby's video talks about this if you want more information. I also talked about it actually in a video called Toronto, How Toronto Got Addicted to Cars. But yeah, so Metro Toronto shared some things, garbage pickup, transit. They worked together on things, but they were their own independent cities. And then Mike Harris comes along and decides to put them all together. Now, I know you mentioned this in your video, and I'm glad you did, but also because I remember at the time in the 90s, everybody was saying, like, he's just doing this because Toronto is liberal. And it was a threat to his agenda, his like neoliberal agenda, and his Conservative Party for Toronto to be a liberal place, because Toronto was massive in the 90s. It used to be that Montreal actually had most of the financial activity, but after there was the whole threat of Quebec leaving Canada, a lot of companies were just like, I don't think we should stay in Montreal. And so they moved their headquarters. Even the Bank of Montreal moved their headquarters to Toronto, which was a really, really big deal. And so Toronto had a lot of power, political power, but also financial power. Like when you look at Toronto in the 90s, like most of Canada's economy was Toronto. And so the amount of power Toronto had, like they easily could have become their own province. And Mike Harris didn't like this at all. So he knew that the card-centric suburbs of Toronto were very conservative. And he wanted them to control Toronto. He knew that if he stuck all these 6 cities together, they would be more conservative than they are liberal. And that was really why it was done. That's what everybody was saying at the time. And they came out with this bullshit line of it being cost cutting and efficiencies. Nobody was buying that. It was very much a political move.
I mean, yeah, on the cost saving things, that's the excuse they tended to give, and they say it over and over for years. But if you look at Mike Harris a few years before he actually announced amalgamation, he's on record. Like, there's a quote of him saying, bigger is not always cheaper.
Yeah.
Like, he changed his position within 2 years. And it wasn't just Toronto he stopped at. Within a few years after that, they amalgamated Ottawa, Hamilton, Sudbury. And then once they had kind of forced through those mergers of the other biggest cities, all of the smaller towns across Ontario, it was kind of like a hostage situation. It was like, either you merge with your neighbors or we're going to force you to. So
Right.
I think they went from 800 towns across Ontario to only 400. So it was province-wide. It wasn't just one city. It was
Yeah.
a huge reshaping of municipal governance.
Yeah, and it's wild. The reason why that can happen is because Canada is a little bit weird. Cities actually don't really exist. They
Yes,
are what they
yeah.
call a creature of the province, is what's normally said. So the province can do whatever the hell they want. Cities don't really have any autonomy. Now, that has slightly changed since amalgamation. And I know Olivia Chow has been also pushing the province to give Toronto more autonomy. It is kind of insane that they had none. But yeah, so the province can kind of do whatever they want. And the cities had their referendums and nobody wanted amalgamation. It was literally like in the 90%. Like, how can you get 90% of a population to agree on anything? But they did agree they didn't want amalgamation and they didn't care.
Yeah, a big thing I looked into for this series was the separation of powers of the 3 levels of government. If you look at like the original founding constitution that Canada was based on, it was written in like the 1860s, which if you think about what was going on at that time, most people in Canada lived on farms or in rural areas. They didn't live
Right.
in cities. It was also a time when we didn't have trains connecting most of the continent. So when the federal constitution was drafted, it was basically a given that we're going to let the provinces and the territories define cities as they saw fit. No one imagined a scenario where I think today 80% of Canadians live in what is considered an urban area.
Right.
It's been swapped in terms of the demographics. And the laws just haven't evolved to, adapt to the times. And this is actually a pattern you see in a lot of the former British colonies. I think it's a similar thing in like Australia and New Zealand. It's just a weird way that like the colonies drafted their constitutions. There's a lot of commonalities there.
Right. That's interesting. And yet in the UK, the city of London, not London, but the thing called the City of London, which is a tiny central part of London, is its own autonomous thing. And that's a whole other mess that they have going on there. But back to Canada. So, I mean, you knew about this Rob Ford stuff when you went into making this video. What kind of things surprised you when you started digging into the research?
I mean, obviously, I knew all the highlights. There's the very famous clips of him that I'm sure a lot of people can quote off of memory. Those are the salacious things. And I think part of the goal of this was to really dig into the less interesting stuff, or at least on the surface, the stuff that feels less interesting. So I wanted to learn about, local politics. What does it mean to be a local councillor? The finances, the history of the city itself. I think a big thing that stuck out to me was the fact that Ontario lacks a party system at the local level. That's actually considered a huge outlier in the world. That's a very Canadian thing that kind of arose during the mid 1900s. And it's something that stuck around, whereas other countries like the US or the UK, the parties that control their federal governments tend to also control their largest cities. Like if you think of New York, it's Republicans versus Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
In Ontario specifically, we don't have that. People don't run in parties. You can run in parties, but they've gotten rid of any advantages of that because you can't share funding between candidates in a party, and the party isn't listed on the ballot. So people are incentivized not to run in parties because there's no advantage.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And it did always surprise me when I started hearing about American politics after knowing Canadian politics, hearing them talk about Republican mayors and Democrat mayors, Democrat cities, and there aren't really a lot of Republican cities, but that this was the thing. And it did strike me as weird. What I did like about, well, before Doug Ford really fucked this up too, who is Rob Ford's brother, but we'll get to him in a sec. But what I did like about Toronto when I lived there is that you have a district that used to be relatively small. Now they're very big and it's too many people because of Doug Ford. But the point was, it used to be that you'd live in a district that was a decent size, and then you voted for your local councillor. And again, no parties or anything. You just had your local councillor. And you vote for the councillor you want. And then that councillor is usually from your area, often lives in your area or nearby. And what I did like about it is that you could go to your local councillor about any issues that you had. So when I was doing advocacy and when my wife she was very, very involved in advocacy, she knew our local councillor very well. Like they got to know each other, they'd like see her on the street and say hello. And so when we were talking about things, like bicycle lanes and public transit issues and all that kind of thing, you had a person that you could get to know who intimately knew your district, and you could talk to that person about your issues. And we had quite a good city councilor who would go to bat for us, right? Like she would go and, I watched the live streams and I would see her talking in council about the issues that we had talked to her about like a few days ago. And I did really like that because, for example, here in Amsterdam, it's very abstracted. They have a totally different voting system, but there is no like local councillor. There are just members of city council. So there isn't like a local person that I can go to. It's very different. So I liked that about Toronto politics. And it's kind of sad that that's going away, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the reason people like that their councillors tend not to be parts of larger political parties, because it allows them to take stances that they would not normally be allowed to take.
Yeah.
There's a lot more freedom for people to be swing votes. I mean, there's a term that's specific to Toronto City Council called the mushy middle. I mean, that was around for a long time, but it was actually a big part of Rob Ford's term as mayor, where they were kind of the swing votes, and the balance of power shifted kind of halfway through Rob Ford's term because the mushy middle stopped siding with Rob Ford and started siding with his opposition.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point about how local councillors are more responsive to like, what's the word I'm thinking of?
Local issues, really.
Local issues, like stuff where it's very tangible. I mean, you think of your MP, and I think an MP might be able to help you a bit with tax and immigration stuff, but that's it in terms of like going to their office.
Mm-hmm.
A local councillor, and I think Rob is a prime example of this, and this is part of the reason he was able to get elected as mayor, is that he was notorious for, if you called him up, he would drive out to your house no matter where you were in the city, and he would help you with basically anything you asked for. And this could be patching a hole in your roof. It could be, calling the right city department about a pothole. Sometimes he would help people move fridges into their house. Like there's an endless amount of stories of stuff that he was going above and beyond what his actual job description was.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I know you mentioned that in your video, and it was really interesting because Rob Ford was famous for that, for giving out his phone number on cards to people all the time. And you could just phone Rob Ford and say, hey, there's a pothole in my street, and he would get somebody out to fill it. And he was incredible that way. And I wish that there was like a world where you could like have a job like that, like he's the fixer and he's the guy you could call. And if he never went beyond that, he could have been a force for good in the world. That made him incredibly popular. He also was like infamous for just literally giving people money.
Yes, he had so much cash on him at all times, and he would just give you his personal cash.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew people who got like $20 from Rob Ford because they were talking to him, said something, and he just gave them $20. And also, there was a whole thing about him potentially buying votes because he also used to just go out on the street, talk to people, and hand them money.
I mean, his other councillors really started to resent him after a certain amount of time because they'd be like, why are you helping someone in my ward? Like, that's my territory. And I think they even complained to the integrity commissioner. And
yeah,
I think their ruling was that there was nothing they could do to stop him from helping anyone across the city. He did have to start cataloging how much of his personal money he was using on like office expenses, because he would never use his office budget, which the taxpayers paid for. He would just pay out of his own pocket. And that was a big thing he campaigned against for years. He wanted to cut the office budget of councillors, and he wanted them to hire less staff.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was one of the things that really annoyed me about him because people would say stuff like, "Oh yeah, he's cutting money and stuff like that." And so no, but he's just using his own
Yeah.
money. And to the people who may not be familiar, Rob Ford was born wealthy. Like
Yes.
his dad had started a company, Deco Labels, a company that made signs and labels and things like that, and it was reasonably successful. And Rob Ford liked to pitch himself as like a business person, but he basically didn't even work at Deco like his brother did.
Yeah, like he had a job there, but I mean, his older brother Doug was clearly the brains of the family business.
Yeah. He was the one that was being like groomed to take over the family business. And then it was kind of like Rob Ford was there too. But like he was just a guy who was born rich. His dad let him work at his company. Like he worked at his dad's company. And this is one of the things that annoyed me so much. He used to always talk about how like he used to say things like city councilors, look at how much money they make. City councilors shouldn't get paid. They shouldn't be taking the taxpayers' money. And it was always like, think that through for a second. Because if you didn't pay city councilors, the only people who could be city councilors would be rich people.
It self-selects.
And this is conversations I used to have with people at the time. They'd be like, hey, he's not using any money. He said he only spent $20 of the taxpayers' money. And I'm like, guys, that's because he was born rich.
Yeah.
And he could just pay for it himself. But like, is this what we want? Do we want a city councilor that's just made up of like rich fail sons? Like, that's the end of that logic.
One of the things that I've learned in researching this that I'm pretty in favor of is, you can quibble over exactly how much a counselor makes. Right now, I think it's upwards of $100,000, which is quite a lot. And, you can argue that. But if you do want to cut their salary, I would argue part of that salary cut should go towards hiring more staff. Because if you want a counselor like Rob Ford, who's attentive to your issues, and you want an office that will pick up a phone call from you, then you need them to have more staff to support them in that. Oftentimes, they only have 3 or 4 staff each.
Yeah, and it's not a lot. And since Doug Ford came in and slashed the number of city councilors in Toronto, they now deal with wards that are twice as big. And so now they're dealing with thousands and thousands of people.
I think the ratio right now is around 1 counselor per upwards of 100,000 residents.
Yeah, and that's just...
It's the most in Canada. Like I checked the ratios.
Yeah.
It used to be half of that before he cut council in half. Currently, it is the worst ratio in the country.
And that's just, if you're going to go with this idea that people have a local counselor that they can talk to, that just doesn't work when they have to deal with so many people. But this kind of gets to one of the other issues that I had with Rob Ford in this philosophy is it's great that he would pick up the phone. It's great that he would do stuff for people, but obviously that's not scalable, right? Like you can't just have Rob Ford solve everything for a city of millions of people. And so at some point in time, you need the government to have departments that do things. Like you can't just have Rob Ford come and fill your pothole. You need a department that fills potholes and that it's their job to find them all and fill them all, not just based on who called Rob Ford last. And that really annoyed me because one of the things Rob Ford consistently did was voted against spending any money on anything, which would have been things like that. Like Toronto has 311, which is a number that you call when you have an issue. You call 311 and 311 will pick up, like an operator will pick up and send your call to a department. And then you talk to a bureaucrat who is responsible for that thing. And I've called 311 about all sorts of stuff. You can do it about like literally anything. You just pick up the phone, call 311, and you talk to them, and then they put it on the list of things to do. That's a scalable system. But like Rob Ford would consistently vote against spending any money on the things that would make that system functional. So again, I was always like, what's the end goal here?
Yeah.
Where does this go? Like, I get that people love it when they can just call Rob Ford, but they should have been calling 311.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories, and this is not just about Rob Ford. This is about, I think, local councillors in general, but there was a study that basically found that there's a sort of David versus Goliath image that local councillors like to portray, where Goliath is the city's bureaucracy, which is slow, unresponsive.
Right.
Especially if you don't speak English as a first language, it can be very difficult to navigate. And people like Rob would position themselves as your local champion. And whereas you call 311 and maybe you're put on hold, what he would do is he knows exactly the right person in every department. And he will say, drop what you're doing, drive out to this location right now. And there's a specific story where he got 2 fire marshals, a bylaw officer, and a public health official to show up to an abandoned property. And he wasn't even there himself. And the fact that a councillor has that much sway with high-ranking city staff is frankly a little absurd. Like, why is he able to bypass the bureaucracy like this? But also, they're not actually getting anything done because these people show up and they're like, I don't know what to do with this property. Like,
Right.
it doesn't actually solve anything.
And that, I mean, this was the populist message of Rob Ford, is that it's like, I can solve your problem. But he didn't actually solve anything. The only problems he ever really solved were like a small issue that an individual had, but it was almost like he was completely blind to the existence of systemic issues. And
Yeah.
it was the most infuriating thing to sit through, because when he would talk about these things, he would talk about like, I went down there and I fixed it. The city won't do it. But then literally the same day would vote against money to let the city do it.
He had a streak of being basically a contrarian on council. So Toronto publishes a list of every single vote in a term for city council.
Yeah. Yeah, you can still see them online, actually, from even back in the day when I do things, because sometimes I'll work on a video where I talk about Toronto and I'll think like, what? And, remind myself of it. And it's all still there. It's actually kind of amazing. And a lot of the city council meetings are still there too on YouTube.
Toronto is actually the first city in the country to do that. And we went digging through all this data. It turns out that Rob Ford is the first mayor in the country that we have a full term of data for, which is kind of ironic because it's like, okay, the most dysfunctional mayor ever is our baseline of data. But what we did is we actually looked through every vote they did on council. There's around 8,000 in his term.
Yeah.
What we did is we sorted it by how many of these votes was he on the winning side of. Because, the mayor's the first among equals. They only have one vote on council, but they have a lot of powers like staff and budget, and they can set priority issues. In theory, the mayor should be winning a lot of votes and directing the business on council.
Well, certainly if you look at John Tory after him, John Tory was on the winning side of everything because of the way he worked like a normal politician. He would go and talk to people. He'd get their agreement on things. He'd change things as necessary. He'd do some agreements here and there. And then when it came time for the vote, it was nobody's first time seeing this, and they all voted in line.
Basically, John Tory would not bring something to council for a vote if he thought he was going to lose.
Right.
That's the difference with Rob. Rob would bring it to council and it just would lose because he doesn't like to compromise. And we actually crunched the numbers. John Tory and Olivia Chow, and this is actually kind of the trend for other mayors across the country, they win about 95% of all votes. Just all votes, procedural, anything. Whereas I think Rob's, by the end of his term, he lost like 22% of his votes. That's 1 in 5.
Right.
Which it's just like you shouldn't be reaching a failure rate that high.
But, I mean, the thing with Rob Ford is that he would just do whatever he wanted. He would propose motions that just didn't make sense in some cases. Like, a lot of the issues I had with Rob Ford when following it as an advocate is that he often just didn't know what was going on.
Yes.
Like, he never read staff reports. He didn't take the time to learn anything. So he was entirely going off a gut feel. So he would sometimes put together these motions that didn't even make sense. Like, as soon as you understood the situation, it was just like what he was proposing, it just didn't make sense. Even if it passed, you'd be like, what do I do with this? It doesn't align with reality.
He had, like him personally, he was not well versed in the procedures of council. He did have a few people on his team who I would call them like seasoned political operatives. There's Nick Kouvalis, who is a famous
I remember him.
campaign manager. He's run a lot of successful campaigns like that of Christy Clark. John Tory, I believe he works with Doug Ford even today. There was also Mark Toohey, who was his like comms and policy guy. They were pulling a lot of strings behind the scenes to get, if Rob Ford did something successfully, it was probably them and the rest of his staff behind it. They were the real brains of the operation.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
it's very
I do
frustrating
get
to think
very
about.
frustrated.
It's like he had a large mandate early on because, he won the election by a pretty large margin. I've looked it up and he won it by, I think, the most that any like non-incumbent year has ever won it.
Right.
So a lot of council was kind of stunned and thought, well, I mean, this is clearly what the city wants. We're going to go along with the new mayor. And then within a year, after he'd made so many missteps, I think a lot of them kind of came to their senses and realized we can actually push back on this. And that's when things started to return more to normal.
Well, I remember when Rob Ford was rising to prominence, most people had no idea what he did or anything. They just heard about this wacky guy. And it was a lot of Trump before Trump, too. It was this idea that he's the only one that tells it like it is. And he's the one that's going to stop the gravy train in city council. There's a lot of slogans and memes. And so, like, people didn't really know Rob Ford, but they knew of Rob Ford.
Yes.
And it really was, ultimately in Toronto, you vote directly for your mayor by name. And so he had the name recognition. And that's where a lot of that support came from. Although he did have legitimate support in Etobicoke.
Yes.
And he had this Ford Nation, they called it. I mean, they were known, you mentioned this in the video too, they were known for having a huge barbecue at their home each year where they would invite everyone in the neighborhood to come by. He was like known as a guy in the neighborhood. And so when he started becoming popular, they started this whole Ford Nation thing where they had these big signs that said Ford Nation and people would identify it the way people identify as MAGA in the US. People would identify as being part of Ford Nation.
It is very interesting that that movement has continued on. The Trump comparisons obviously began to occur in like 2016 when Trump was running for president. Yeah. The Fords predate that by at least 5 years.
Yeah.
At the time, we didn't really have, the Trump movement as a comparison, and a lot of comparisons were made with Rob and the Tea Party movement in the Republican Party in 2010. That was a closer analog. Obviously now there's some ideological splits between Doug Ford and Donald Trump. They're actively in a trade war. The rallies were a big thing. They would have very large crowds gather. So there's some surface level similarities.
Very similar to Trump in there. And I would say, I think we compared it to the Tea Party at the time because the Tea Party was the only reference that we had of a popular political movement, but he was definitely more like the MAGA Trump thing we know in retrospect. The Tea Party was more like what was called the Alliance Party in Canada that took over the Conservative Party. They were a lot more...
That's more like Paul Ryan, which he's very distinct from Trump, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So that was more, when you look back with hindsight, the split between the Progressive Conservatives and the Alliance Party was more like the Tea Party in the US, whereas Rob Ford was Trump before Trump. So yeah, he definitely had those big rallies, and I remember them. And he would just go up there, and it was also very similar to Trump, that he would go up there and just be saying...
He would say stuff off the dome. He wasn't thinking it through.
Yeah, off the dome, just yapping. He called everybody folks.
Yes.
He's like, listen, folks, we're going to stop the gravy train up there at City Hall. And like that was the sum total of the intellectual level of these rallies, but they really got people excited.
One thing I do want to bring up, and I found this pretty interesting researching it, is although Rob had a history of saying some pretty racist things, and I do think he was probably racist, he didn't center his campaign around xenophobia the same way that Trump did with like his border wall stuff.
No, not even
Rob
close.
actually had a very strong base of support in immigrant communities in the outer suburbs of Toronto. These are, places that are pretty socially conservative. Maybe there's a religious bend to it, but he never talked about like, people are coming here and it's different races. He didn't focus on like the white race or any of that. It was very much like
none of that.
Bread and butter issues.
No, and he used to hang out with everybody of every race. Like he was famous for the photos. He'd be in a Jamaican patty restaurant, taking photos with people and stuff. And he was constantly even before he was married, he was constantly getting drunk and showing up at random places. And Toronto is an extraordinarily multicultural city. And so he would show up drunk at some whatever. Jamaican restaurants were always his favorite, but all sorts of places. And so he was always hanging out with everybody. And I don't know if Rob Ford was racist, to be honest. I don't think anybody could know. But I lean on the fact that he actually wasn't. He was just kind of a dumbass.
It's mean to say, but he was. He was not a very smart guy. If one of the brothers was smart, Doug's the smarter one. I don't think anyone would contest that.
Yeah, for sure. I don't like Doug at all, but he was definitely way smarter than Rob Ford. And I think that when I look at, again, living through it and watching him, when he would say racist comments, like he made a comment about Italians, but he called them Genos or something like that. Does anyone even use that word?
Yeah, I was going to say, I looked into this. I think the best I can find, it might be unique to Toronto, so it might be a regional thing, but it's like a slur that I've never even heard of, and he's whipping it out. Like,
I know, like that was that kind of racism. It's like, because he's a moron, and like he would hang out with people who would say all sorts of stupid shit, and he would also say stupid shit. But like calling Italians Genos is like, that's not a racist thing at the time he said it. It would have been in the early 1900s, but like, he's just dumbass.
I think it comes from his father. Like he uses a lot of expressions that his father would have used, and it makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense
It
in
was
that
that
context.
folks
He's
thing.
repeating something he grew up hearing. His father, when he was running for re-election for like his provincial seat, he was on CBC, and I think he basically says a racial slur on camera, referring to some of the like Somali community voting for him. Like they have no filter.
Yeah. And I always got the impression that's where it came from, just that his father was probably an old-timey racist, the same as my grandfather was very much an old-timey racist too, when you'd get him talking about the Japanese or something. But like, then he would just say stupid shit without thinking about it. But that was one thing that I did appreciate about him, is that he would treat everybody pretty much the same, no matter where you were from, unless, of course, you rode a bicycle. And then he fucking hated you. And I mean, that was the other thing in his rise to power, was he decided to start the war on cars. And when you hear about the popularization of that term, the war on cars, it really came from him, from Rob Ford. A few people had used that term before him, but it really came from him. And he decided that, as somebody who was from not just Etobicoke, but like the very edge of Etobicoke, like basically not in Toronto. Like he was a couple of kilometers from the border of Toronto. And this is as suburban as it gets. His district, it was a place where over 90% of people drove cars to get wherever they were going. There was basically no public transit there. And that was a big rallying cry for him. He was one of the first, certainly, I've seen this doing urban planning stuff. There's a lot of politicians now that take a pro-car agenda. I mean, I had an earlier podcast episode with Adam Something who was talking about Czechia, where there's the Motorists for Themselves Party, which is a far-right party. That's become a thing now. But Rob Ford was one of the first to like make that a wedge issue, the cars versus cyclists thing.
Yeah, and there was a lot of, I mean, it's one of those causes where it can be so broad you can apply it to any cause that he doesn't like.
It was the same as his gravy train thing, right? Like people could interpret that as anything.
Like the Jarvis Street bike lanes was a big one. He ripped those up.
Yeah.
He was very anti-streetcar. And, Toronto streetcars have a lot of problems, but, he wanted to get rid of them entirely.
I made a video about that.
And then there was also the VRT, which was the vehicle registration tax.
Right.
I think that was a big reason that helped him get elected, because the mayor right before him introduced 2 new taxes in the wake of the Great Recession. I mean, we were talking about financial restrictions earlier, but basically it's very hard for cities to introduce new taxes. And that was one of the few taxes that the province allowed Toronto to introduce. And then as soon as a new mayor comes in, they get rid of it. So they've immediately lost an important source of new revenue.
Toronto taxes are a serious issue because they also, and Rob Ford did this, he just kept property tax the same all the time and would refuse to increase it. And Toronto is completely crushed right now under its burden because they froze taxes for so long under Rob Ford. And then it was so difficult to do it under John Tory as well, that the city had massive budget issues. It's still recovering from.
Yeah, I think a pattern I saw in pretty much every mayoral term, with maybe the exception of David Miller, because he did try to introduce these new taxes, is to avoid raising taxes, you would just kick the budgetary problem down the road and hope that the new mayor has to resolve it. And you see it now with Olivia Chow, where John Tory didn't raise taxes substantially for his 8 years in office. And the first year she's in office and actually raises them, basically making up for all that lost time, she gets a lot of the blame now. And people think, well, my services and infrastructure are crumbling, which is a carryover of the previous years, but she's the one getting the blame because services are still bad, but now she's raised my taxes. And she's kind of walked back on that in the lead up to, she's in an election year. I think she's back down to like a pretty matching inflation rate tax increase. So she's had to back off of that because of the realities of playing politics. If she wants to get reelected, she can't actually make difficult choices.
And I don't know how Toronto comes back from this because they do have an incredible maintenance backlog across every possible thing you could imagine. Everything from roads to transit to everything. And they've just been pushing it farther and farther down the line. And this definitely started with Rob Ford and this idea that like taxes can never be increased ever.
Yeah, it's like inflation or below. That's the max you're allowed to raise it.
Yeah, inflation and below, that's all you're ever able to do. But the issue is that they froze them for so many years that it's not even an issue. Like, okay, you could say, okay, inflation is all you're going to increase taxes. Fine. If you had done that forever, maybe. But when you froze taxes for years and years and years and years, I mean, you have to make up that deficit at some point in time. So what Toronto did, David Miller brought in two taxes. One was that vehicle registration tax that Rob Ford got rid of, made political. I mean, it's ludicrous. It was all the city was allowed to do from the province. They wanted to put in a congestion tax, but the province wouldn't let them. So they had to go with the vehicle registration tax. The other tax he introduced was the land transfer tax, which Rob didn't get rid of.
He wanted to. He
did.
Couldn't convince enough of council to join him, basically.
Well, I think the thing was, council realized that they would literally have no money if they didn't have the land transfer tax. And so the land transfer tax is a tax you pay when you buy a property, and it's a percentage of the property price. And Toronto has a massive, one of the worst housing crises in the world. And housing prices have gone insane. And so the land transfer tax has become a huge part of Toronto's financing to the point where there's absolutely no way they can get rid of it. But the prices have not gone down. Well, they have in the condo market, but they have plateaued. And now the land transfer tax is not bringing in as much as they expected it to bring in. And so now it's an even bigger crunch because Toronto basically subsidized itself by taking a slice off of high housing prices for years in order to make up for the fact that they didn't increase or do anything with property taxes.
That and development charges too.
Yeah, and development,
which is a whole other subject. I don't think I really touch on that in the documentary.
Yeah, I don't even want to go into that, but we have my wife has a very, very close family friend who works as a lawyer at the city of Toronto. And boy, that's always like, the dealing with developers to reduce their taxes if they do things the city wants them to do. It's such a clusterfuck, but that's a whole other issue.
On the topic of other taxes, I will say that Toronto is actually unique in Ontario because the city negotiated specifically with the province to get themselves those abilities to add those new taxes.
Yeah.
Ottawa, the second biggest city, we can't do that.
Yep.
Even though we probably should have the same powers that Toronto has. You can make a case for the smaller towns probably shouldn't, but I mean, we're growing cities in a very fast growing province and nothing has really changed since 2006 when Toronto got those powers.
I mean, yeah, it's a massive problem. And it comes down to this idea that cities are a creature of the province and can't really do anything themselves. And so you look to the provincial government and they're simply not going to implement something like a congestion charge that Toronto should have, that Toronto was talking about even literally 25 years ago. They were talking about implementing a congestion charge because, there's a huge number of people who live in the outer suburbs around Toronto who drive into Toronto every day and they don't pay any taxes to Toronto at all. And yet they're the cars that fill all the roads in Toronto and there's nothing Toronto can do about it.
There's always talk about sales taxes. I don't personally know if that's the best solution, but at the end of Rob Ford's term, the city manager under him, as he was leaving the job, he was giving interviews and saying, yeah, we should probably have a sales tax.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think at this point in time, it's just that the hole has been dug so deep, a lot of it because of Rob Ford. And now Toronto just needs to do, they're looking for literally anything. The sales tax is not the best solution, but it's at the situation of what the hell else are they going to do? And this gets to my other major annoyance with the Rob Ford myth. He would always say he saved the city $1 billion. That was one of his quips. And he would say it over and over and over again, that he saved the city $1 billion. When he was going for re-election, I saved the city $1 billion. He never saved the city $1 billion. And you uncovered some of that too. There was a lot of double counting.
You need to do some creative definitions. There's double counting. There's also projected savings that never quite materialized. The definition never made sense. And I believe the city manager at the time said, if you apply the same definitions that Rob Ford wants to use to the previous mayor, then the previous mayor actually saved the city more money.
It's one of those things where if you say a lie often enough, people start to believe it. And it really was one of those things. Like he would do something where like he canceled the garbage contract and counted that as a savings to taxpayers. But then you still have to pay a private company for the garbage. But he didn't count that as like transferring one to the other.
Yeah, like at the time, it did save money because the private companies were like, we'll offer a cheaper contract.
Yeah.
But city council, I believe, they were looking, I mean, John Tory, who is Rob's successor, wanted to privatize the eastern half of the city because Rob privatized the western half. And he would constantly like do these studies and try and convince council it would be cheaper to do the whole city. Turns out that's not actually the case. It's actually more expensive to use the private contractors now than the public unionized ones, and it never went through.
Yeah. And this is that whole myth of Rob Ford. And the other thing, I know I mentioned it to you before the call, but the other thing that just still blows my mind that wasn't reported on more widely, Rob Ford had a secret debt account called Unfinanced Capital that was almost $1 billion. So this was literally like he had worked individually with a city manager to open a debt account that, I mean, cities need debt accounts because there are times, just even for just cash flow issues, right? Like you've got money coming in, you know, you need to spend it, it's budgeted, but you've got a gap where the money's not going to be in by the time you need it. And so you have this debt account, and that's fine. But he had this account that was opened without the approval of city council. It's wild how much shit he was able to do without the approval of city council, which, you know, also kind of foretelling what Donald Trump ended up going on to do as well. But like, how can you just open a debt account and then just use it and let it rack up to almost $1 billion in debt? And city council didn't know anything about it. The only way that it was found was when John Tory came in as mayor, and he brought in people to go through the finances to see what the situation was. And it came out in those first few weeks of that audit. And so it's like, not only was he lying when he said he saved the city $1 billion, not only was he double counting and counting things that weren't even savings, he also racked up $1 billion in debt. And it's just wild that there is this myth that surrounds him still. So many people in Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big consequence that we're still feeling now is that mayors in Canada are not actually as powerful as you might think they are. Certainly in comparison to the US mayors are considered a strong mayor system. Canadian mayors are more of a weak mayor system. They're on council. They only have one vote. They can't really appoint department heads one-on-one. Council directs the city manager and the staff, not just the mayor.
Yep.
But what happened recently is his brother Doug, who's in charge of the province, introduced a lot of laws to change that. Because, I mean, I think, and Doug has talked about this openly, is that he comes from the private sector where if you have a CEO, the CEO, whatever they say goes. It's not a voting thing. So he wants the mayor to be able to veto legislation if they don't agree with it. He wants to be able to appoint department heads. Drafting the city budget used to be done by committee on council. It's now drafted by just the mayor's office. And that's a lot of subtle changes that pile up. And that's been, I believe, it started with Toronto, but it's been given to pretty much most of the province's smaller towns. And this is a really big impact on the smaller towns because most of the staff for a small rural town might be a dozen people. And suddenly the mayor can appoint, you know, their family friends, and they fill every position in a city staff.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Toronto's mayor was too weak. There was no denying that.
I agree to a certain extent, yeah.
Like the fact that they only had the one vote on council. But the things that Doug Ford has done are quite dangerous. And this is one of those things that I really don't like when people say that we should be running government like a business for all sorts of reasons. But ultimately, businesses are dictatorships. The CEO really does say what happens. And then a very small number of people, the board of directors, have control of the CEO, and that's it. Governments are supposed to be ruled by the people. It's a democracy. It is a totally different system. I would actually argue that businesses should be less like dictatorships. And you see that happening in Germany, for example, where a certain percentage of unions, people on the board of directors need to be voted in by the union for exactly that reason, because you shouldn't have a company that can just be this massive company that can have so much power and money within a country that they can control the government, lobby the government, as you see is done in the United States all the time, which is very easy to just buy power in government in the US. So the idea is that if you have a large company, it shouldn't be run like a dictatorship. There should be some worker representation on at least the board of directors, if not, worker co-ops and other things like that. It is extremely dangerous to have the mayor of a city act like a CEO. That is a fucking terrible idea.
I'll also bring up another thing, and this directly pertains to Rob, and we saw it happen in 2013 at the height of the crack scandal. Canada doesn't really have ways to remove politicians for conduct that is, probably not befitting the office, but hasn't progressed into the criminal level. So Rob Ford was never charged with any criminal offense, not for like the crack stuff, not for any of the other things he might have done. But obviously he's on video smoking crack, and a lot of his colleagues on council felt we should remove him from his position. They can't do that without a criminal conviction. So what they could do, and this is the most they were allowed to do by law, is remove his special powers, because that's something that council delegates to the mayor. I believe that it was in a couple of years, I think last year, the Doug Ford government passed a law saying if all of council is unanimous, they can now remove a person from office. And that actually came out of a case in Ottawa where we had a city councillor, Rick Shirelli. He was found by a city investigation to have sexually harassed his staff, allegedly, I will say. The city was like, we're going to dock your pay because we can't push you out of office because there's no criminal conviction. So because of that,
right.
I think now you could do that. But, back in the day, Doug Ford would never have voted to remove his brother, so it wouldn't have mattered anyway. It wouldn't have been unanimous.
Yeah. Getting unanimous on a council the size of Toronto's would be extremely difficult.
That's very difficult. It's a 44-person council. There's always going to be one person who's going to say no.
Even if they just don't believe that people should be able to be removed, you get that one guy who thinks that, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of progress. I think that law needs some changes too.
I think one of the things we've learned with Rob Ford and with Donald Trump is that a lot of the rules around government were just handshake agreements.
Suggestions.
Yeah. They were all from the days when the only people who could be in government were rich landowners, and they all shook hands and agreed that they were all going to have some level of decorum. And nobody ever wrote any of that down.
Decorum, I think, is a big thing in this story where sometimes there's, I think, an obsession with decorum in Canadian politics. I certainly think there is a large portion of the Canadian population who would look at the US and they would look at Donald Trump and say, well, at least we're not as bad as that because we're polite and we say sorry. But we've had politicians like that. Like the first prime minister, John A. Macdonald, was notoriously an alcoholic. He would show up to key debates and he'd be so drunk he couldn't stand. So the idea that Canada is this country that values decorum so much, I don't think has ever been true. And it certainly wasn't true with the Rob Ford saga.
Well, no, absolutely not. I mean, Rob Ford, I guess, was following in the footsteps of John A. Macdonald. Let's put it that way. The number of times that asshole was just totally wasted. I don't know if he was drunk or high or what, but I mean, a lot of those normal videos never really came out in the press, but I was watching the live streams on YouTube and you can see that he's slurring his words. He no idea what's going on. He's calling people by wrong names. It was wild how long that was able to go on, to be honest.
I will say a lot of the reason it didn't become public so quickly is because his staff, knowingly covered it up.
Yeah.
There was a rule within his office set by, I believe, one of his chiefs of staff where if Rob Ford was behind the wheel of a car, you were not allowed to get in the car with him because they were fearful he might have been drunk. That is a rule set by the staff. That's how bad it was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was really, really, really bad. So anyway, I think we could definitely talk about Rob Ford for hours, but I'm going to cap it there.
Very fair, yeah.
I think I am really looking forward to the other videos that you have in the pipeline. I think it's going to be interesting. I'm curious to watch it myself because between 2006 and 2013, I was living in the UK and Taiwan and Belgium, and I followed Toronto politics, but I didn't closely follow Toronto politics. So I suspect you're going to find some things that will be a surprise to me as well. Any last thoughts on Rob Ford before we close this out?
I mean, I got a lot of thoughts. I guess if you're unfamiliar with the story, I hope that you give it a watch. I think you'll learn a lot, not just about this guy specifically, but also local politics in general, which I think is more interesting than you might think on the surface.
This is one thing that I mentioned so many times on my channel. People have to get involved in local politics.
It has the most direct impact on your day-to-day.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Like, people always talk about their prime ministers and their presidents and stuff, and they have an influence. But wow, like, your local city councilor, your local mayor has so much more of an impact on your day to day. You have to vote in your municipal elections. And it would blow my mind sometimes when there would be elections that would have like 20%, 30% turnout. And some like useless city councilor who was the incumbent, and normally incumbents win in municipal politics, some absolute useless person who, I'm watching the live streams. I can see this person doesn't do their job, doesn't read things, doesn't vote any way that makes sense for their district. And they still just keep getting voted in again and again and again. And sometimes by like 300 votes.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating to me because I'm like, if people could just pay attention to their local politics, to their municipal politics, the cities would be so much better. And I think this is one of these things that Rob Ford capitalized on. A lot of people are like, oh, governments are useless. They don't do anything.
They think it's boring.
Yeah, they think it's boring, but they also don't think that governments are able to change things for the better. A lot of people have given up hope. This is one of these things that I really like with Mamdani getting elected in New York. He hit the ground running. He has immediately come in there, and he's been like I was just watching a press conference from him where there was this terrible, dangerous street where a bunch of people were killed, and the city was talking about improving it for years and had plans and everything like that, and just hadn't moved forward with it. And Mamdani comes in and says, we're doing it now. As soon as the weather thaws, we're doing it, period. And people can see that the government is actually doing something.
Political will is a real thing. Like, if you say we're doing this, it can actually happen. But,
yeah,
people get complacent.
They do. And they get too cynical when it comes to municipal politics. Because one of the other things that I want to say just before we close out here is that I got to know some Toronto city councilors. Like Joe Cressy was a great example. He actually cared. Like, he genuinely actually cared. And I think people get into politics for all sorts of reasons. And there certainly are people who get in so that they can, bring their friends in and do some it gets paid bribes and stuff like that. People definitely do that. And I knew people on city council who were clearly doing that. But there are other people like Joe Cressy who actually genuinely care. And I think the politicians who actually care and actually want to fix something are way more likely to show up in municipal politics than they are in any other level of politics.
Yes.
And I think this was one of these things that Rob Ford capitalized on, was that these people who had given up hope, who had just assumed the government was useless, saw somebody who was in there making strong statements. And they were like, I'm going with that guy just because he's going to get shit done.
He energized a lot of voters who typically don't turn out for local elections.
Yeah. And I think that more than anything, what we should learn as, if you are an urbanist listening to this podcast, that's what you should take from Rob Ford more than anything, is that there is a massive amount of people out there who just don't vote in municipal politics. And if you can find a way to activate them, and Mamdani did exactly the same thing, then you can change your city for the better. But anyway, that's enough for now. Great to talk to you. I will leave links to Bobby Broccoli's channel on Nebula and YouTube, and you can check out the Rob Ford videos. The first one, as we record this, is on Nebula. It's going to be on YouTube before this comes out.
It will be on YouTube by the time this is out, I think.
Yeah, it definitely will, because these always take a little while to edit and get out. But thanks so much for coming on. And, I'd be happy to have you on again sometime to talk more about Canada, whatever. It was a good conversation. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Urbanist Agenda. As usual, all new episodes will be available early on Nebula. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, now might be a good time. You can sign up at nebula.tv/agenda. And with a subscription to Nebula, you not only support this podcast, you also get access to content by over 150 creators. That's everything from videos to podcasts to classes and more. Nebula is also constantly adding new Nebula originals, which are high budget productions on a wide range of interesting topics. If you use our link, which again is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount on a yearly subscription, which brings it down to only $30 a year. I'm a big fan of Nebula, which is why all of my Not Just Bikes videos are available there, as well as some that are only available on Nebula, and of course, all episodes of the Urbanist Agenda. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, go check it out today, and thanks again for listening.